Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in that world, there's always room for a little variety. After all, we live in a messy, chaotic world. Oftentimes, a little variety is necessary to fill specific roles, complete particular tasks, and tell unique stories. We may have our favorite brand or version, but we still try others, if only to see what they have to offer. That same sentiment extends to the world of superheroes, of which there is plenty of variety. There's just so much to choose from in terms of characters, stories, art, and writing style. And even within those choices, there could be even more variations. If you feel like Peter Parker's Spider-Man just isn't doing it for you anymore, you can give Miles Morales a try. If Clark Kent's Superman just isn't enough, you have another version in his son, John Kent. And if Logan isn't enough Wolverine for you, you can also check out Laura/X-23 or his son, Dakin. And these are all variations that don't require alternate universes or time travel. The sheer breadth of content is just that rich. But, as diverse as that content can be, not every variation is the same. Some are so wildly different they might as well be separate entities. I think shows like What If and stories like Injustice: Gods Among Us nicely demonstrate that. But, every now and then, certain variations stand out in unexpected ways. Sometimes that's a good thing, a la X-23. Sometimes it's not so good, a la the Spider-Man clone saga. It can often leave fans conflicted, leading to plenty of arguments over which character or story is better, relatively speaking. And having participated in plenty of those arguments, I'd like to highlight one such variation. While it hasn't led to any especially heated arguments, it's one that has left me more conflicted than most. And it involves Ultron. Specifically, it involves two well-known versions of Ultron. One being the Ultron from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, voiced by James Spader, the other being the Ultron from the animated series Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes, also known as EMH. Now, I'll go on record saying I like both versions of these characters. But I often find myself comparing them whenever I contemplate the best version of Ultron. And, in the spirit of celebrating variations, I'd like to explore what makes these characters great, where they have their shortcomings, and which Ultron I believe is the best. In the end, I hope this helps inform your opinion on what goes into the best version of this iconic villain. To appreciate the many versions of any character, it's also necessary to understand the original. Ultron, by his own nature, has many variations, both in terms of the bodies he inhabits and the roles he plays. He first appeared in 1968 with Avengers 55, courtesy of writer Roy Thomas and artist John Buscema. And his origins have always been closely tied to the Avengers, specifically Hank Ant-Man Pym. He's the one who created Ultron. He even modeled Ultron's code after his own brain patterns, including his strengths as well as his flaws, of which Hank has many. And almost immediately after coming online, Ultron magnifying those flaws to the utmost. He comes to see Hank as his father and grows to hate them with the fury of a billion Oedipus stories. That hatred gets extended to the whole of humanity, and later on, the whole of all biological life. Pretty much every story about him revolves around killing Hank, the Avengers, and every living creature in the universe. Over the years, Ultron's murderous inclinations have taken many forms. His capabilities have also evolved a great deal. In more than one timeline, he's defeated the Avengers, destroyed all life on Earth, and even destroyed entire timelines. That overpowered version you saw in the What If finale? That's a disturbingly accurate demonstration of what Ultron is capable of. But, at his core, Ultron is the ultimate murder machine. A robot whose sole purpose is to destroy all life on Earth and beyond. How he gets to that point and how he carries himself in the process may change. But his primary motivation, his source code so to speak, it all comes back to destroying all life. He's not some evil organization like Hydra. He's not some invading alien force like the Kree or the Skrulls. He's just this singular, malevolent force, one created by a fellow hero and Avenger no less. And whenever he shows up, the stakes are very high, and the margin for error very low. Since that first iteration, Ultron has manifested in many other forms and shown up in many other mediums. Both the MCU and Earth's Mightiest Heroes draw from this origin. Both also give Ultron their own unique twist. And it's here where the variations really start to diverge, both from the source material and from each other. Avengers Age of Ultron is one of those movies with a mixed but mostly positive reputation. Yes, it has some major flaws that are worth pointing out, but few of those flaws are attributed to Ultron. While his origins changed considerably, having been created by Tony Stark instead of Hank Pym, his motivations are still the same for the most part. As soon as he comes online, he determines that the human race must be destroyed. He needed only to spend a few seconds on the internet to come to that conclusion. And most people who venture into the poorly moderated regions of social media probably wouldn't blame him. The Ultron of the Marvel Cinematic Universe definitely gets the murder bot part down. That is by far the most important aspect of Ultron's character. But the MCU didn't stop at making Ultron this overpowered killer robot. They actually sought to give him a personality. When you have someone like James Spader doing his voice, that's entirely understandable. That's the kind of voice that echoes with personality. But giving it to a killer robot presents a host of challenges. Remember, Ultron's motivations are very basic. He hates all life and seeks to destroy it. But, basic or not, he makes those motivations personal. His hatred of all life extends directly from his hatred of his creator. And the movie does touch on that at one point, albeit barely. When Ultron confronts Ulysses Klaue in South Africa, he gets very upset when Stark is mentioned, so much so that he rips Klaue's arm off. That dynamic is hinted at again when the Avengers confront him. Tony even talks down to him like a rebellious child at one point. It definitely highlights the whole creation resenting their creator dynamic, and that same dynamic plays out once Ultron creates Vision, who would ultimately go on to defeat him. But it's also here where the MCU's Ultron feels a bit underwhelming at times. Because once that dynamic is touched on, it largely falls to the wayside, reverting mostly to just the Avengers fighting armies of Ultron robots, all while Ultron waxes poetic about destroying humanity. In place of that angle, Ultron's Spader-fueled personality takes center stage. He spends more time talking about destroying humanity than actually destroying it, making all these strange biblical references along the way. While it does reflect a serious god complex, it seems oddly out of place for a killer robot. Plus, his whole rant about having no strings on him didn't always make much sense. Now, none of that is to say that he's a bad character. Personally, I liked seeing Ultron with a unique voice and personality. It helped give him a bigger presence. If he'd been all robot and no personality, then he'd just be a blander version of Skynet from the Terminator movies. But at the same time, that personality didn't always mesh with his killer robot motivations. All his strange musings, as well as his chosen method of carrying out his murderous plan, just didn't always fit. Marvel fans will always still remember that distinct voice, but they're less inclined to remember the whole wipe out life with a meteor plot. Before the Marvel Cinematic Universe became the gold standard for everything Marvel, most fans of the early 2010s agreed. Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes set the highest bar for all things Marvel. Many will contend that it's the greatest Marvel cartoon ever made, and I certainly believe that argument could be made. This show did so many things right. It took the same approach to the Avengers that Richard Donner took to Superman. take the core essence of the characters, stay true to those traits, and build a world around them. That approach gave us some great versions of Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Black Panther, Hulk, and Hawkeye. And years before they established themselves in the MCU, no less. And this same approach gives us a very memorable version of Ultron. In this show, Ultron is a lot more in line with his comic book origins. Like the comics, he's created by Hank Pym. But, unlike the comics, or his MCU version for that matter, Ultron doesn't become so murder-happy seconds after he comes online. At first, he's a pacifist, just like Hank in this world. His primary task was to guard the special prisons housing the various supervillains that the Avengers capture, as well as help rehabilitate them. He has little personality beyond that. He's just a robot who helps Hank further his pacifist goals. But that all changes after a battle against Kang the Conqueror. To win that battle, Hank has to reprogram Ultron. He needed to teach him some measure of violence so that they stood a chance against Kang. That ends up being the greatest turning point for Ultron. Shortly after learning this new way of violence, he comes to the inescapable conclusion that every version of Ultron reaches. As long as there is life, there will always be violence. And in order to end violence, he must end all life. It is a cold, callous calculation, but one that's oddly in keeping with Hank's overly analytical nature. It also perfectly reflects Ultron's core nature as the ultimate killer robot. Yes, this version of Ultron has less of an Oedipus complex. He also lacks the charisma of his MCU counterpart, as well as his tendency to overly contemplate his purpose. Now, that's not a knock on Tom Kane, who voices Ultron in this show. But that larger, over-the-top personality espoused by James Spader isn't necessary here. Because in EMH, Ultron is just a robot, an engine of cold logic. That impersonal, mechanical nature never changes in anything he does. And he does quite a lot throughout the show, more so than his MCU counterpart. This version of Ultron is constantly upgrading himself, constantly seeking more effective ways to wipe out all life on Earth. Whether it's launching every nuclear weapon at once or creating robot versions of the Avengers, Ultron is driven by the same callous logic. Even if his voice was flat and his methods blunt, he still ends up being one of the most tenacious villains of the entire show. Few characters pushed the Avengers to the brink as much as Ultron did. Defeating him often required the full team. And even when the Avengers won the day, it often left a serious impact, especially on Hank Pym. Ultron's story in Earth's Mightiest Heroes extended far beyond just being a major threat to the Avengers. What he did ended up having a major impact on the overall course of the show. That's a big part of what made him so memorable. And the characters, as well as the overall show, were better because of it. Speaking as a lifelong Marvel fan, I can safely say that I like both these versions of Ultron. They each bring something unique to the table. The MCU Ultron brought charisma to a character whose range has always been limited, as tends to be the case with robots. He doesn't just test the Avengers with raw power and malice, he attacks them on a personal level, undermining the ideals and motivations that drive them to be heroes. That attack on their mentality is what really sets this version of Ultron apart. He doesn't stop at simply concluding that humanity needs to be wiped out. He'll go out of his way to justify it in front of those most determined to oppose him, exploiting every personal flaw and insecurity, and instilling in them a sense of dread and doubt. That's what helps make this version of Ultron so uniquely imposing. The EMH Ultron is also incredibly imposing, but in a very different way. Even when compared to the comics, this version of Ultron is undeniably cold. He's as unfeeling and uncaring as any machine can be. On more than one occasion, he says outright that he takes no pleasure in his effort to wipe out humanity. He's only doing this because it's part of his purpose. He was programmed to end violence. And the only way to do that was to wipe out all life on Earth. That utter lack of humanity makes this version of Ultron extra menacing. It's not nearly as personal to him. He's not doing this out of hatred for his creator. It really wouldn't matter if he were built by Hank Pym, Tony Stark, Reed Richards, or Howard the Duck. So long as he's programmed to end violence, this will be his recourse. It isn't personal. There's no larger vision behind it. It's just pure logic born of computer code. How each version of Ultron carries themselves is distinct, but the end result is the same. Both versions of Ultron conclude that humanity must be wiped out. In addition, they were both created by brilliant men who sought a more peaceful world. Tony Stark called it peace in our time. Hank Pym called it a world without violence. But noble intentions or not, these brilliant men were also deeply flawed. Tony Stark in the MCU practically wears his flaws on his sleeve. His ego, his ambition, and his tendency to cross lines to solve problems, those all manifest in Ultron as well. In EMH, Hank's flaws were more subtle, but still painfully obvious. His aversion to violence, as well as his desire to end it, went to terrifying extremes within Ultron. He was driven so much by the science and the data that he forgot to instill a sense of humanity. And because of that, he created something that nearly destroyed the world. As a result, these two versions of Ultron tested the Avengers in ways few others could. The stakes were high as well as personal. That's what makes their respective stories so memorable. But, in terms of which is better, well, that's up to each individual fan. And on that front, I certainly have my preferences. Avengers Age of Ultron was a good movie. I certainly enjoyed it when I saw it in the theaters, and Ultron was a big part of why I liked it. Now, I still wouldn't call it a great movie. The MCU sets a pretty high bar for greatness, and compared to the rest of the MCU, this movie is average to above average at best. But with respect to Ultron, I feel like the movie got all the basics right. It made Ultron the ultimate killer robot. It had to tweak his origins a bit, but the end product was still the same. But it's the details beyond the basics where things fall a bit short. James Spader gave a great performance voicing Ultron. But, like I said before, there was a bit too much talking and not enough doing. Yes, Ultron had a plan, but that plan seemed a bit overly elaborate at times. Something more in line with a standard evil supervillain rather than an unfeeling robot. Having more personality than the Terminator is all well and good, but when it distracts from his core motivation, then it just feels inconsistent. By contrast, there's no ambiguity with Ultron and EMH. At no point in the show are we uncertain of his purpose, even before he becomes violent. Ultron is a machine through and through. He's entirely guided by his programming. It might not be in line with what his creator intended, but that's where the data leads him. There's no grand vision behind it. There's no love, hate, joy, or pain involved. There's only pure, dispassionate logic. This, in my opinion, is what makes the Earth's Mightiest Heroes Ultron the superior Ultron. He never tries to convince anyone that what he's doing is right or justified. He just says repeatedly that he's following his program. He's going to end violence. Doing so just happens to involve wiping out all life on Earth. He's not someone you can appeal to personally or emotionally manipulate. He's a robot with a program to follow. Something you can only confront directly. And honestly, I found this version of Ultron much more compelling, not to mention much more menacing. And if I had a choice, I'd gladly go with seeing this Ultron over the MCU Ultron. Again, that's not to say that I dislike what the MCU did with Ultron. I think, for what the movie needed to be, that version of Ultron worked. It just wasn't the best take on the character, in my opinion. For me personally, EMH gave us a superior Ultron, and I don't see it being topped anytime soon. I don't doubt that there will be other versions of Ultron in the future. There will likely be other versions of many characters, and not just with Marvel. But different versions of iconic characters have a way of highlighting what makes them great in the first place. Ultron has been one of Marvel's biggest villains for over 50 years now. He's one of those villains who constantly pushes the heroes to the brink. Whenever Ultron shows up, you know things are about to get epic. There's just no gray area for a villain like him. He's a killer robot determined to wipe out all life. He might have been created by a hero, but he became something far beyond what anyone intended. And in some perverse way, he wants to save the world too. But his program and his advanced AI only offer one recourse: the destruction of all life. Both the MCU and EMH capture the essence of this villainy. They each set out to make Ultron the kind of threat that requires the Avengers to fully assemble in order to stop him. And in that sense, they both succeeded. And we, the fans, got to enjoy the spectacle every step of the way. Each version has their strengths and weaknesses. Each is part of their own unique story. While I believe the EMH version to be superior, I still enjoy both stories. There's no getting around the appeal. Earth's mightiest heroes coming together to stop the ultimate killer robot. And I look forward to seeing more of those stories in the future. But what do you think? Do you agree with my preference for Earth's Mightiest Heroes Ultron over the MCU Ultron? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.